So hopefully this is successfully capturing my screen. This is a talk on Docker for development. My name is Geri Jennings. I live locally. I commute to a company in Boston. Maybe more appropriate to switch to this side. So I'm a software engineer at CyberArk. I work on a team that builds a tool called Conjure for secrets management. The company is based out of Newton, Mass, but we're a distributed team. And so I mostly work from Northampton. I also organize the local full stack meetup, which goes through the Western Mass Developers Designers Meetup group. So if you're interested in coming to see talks on, well, Docker or different languages, next month's talk is called The Humble Data Frame with Becky, who is a data engineer at Trello, giving us a talk. She works locally as well. I also recently created a resource list on GitHub. It's my GitHub username is Geri Western Mass Tech, and it has a list of local resources like co-working spaces, funding sources, resources for tech learning. I'd love if people would go there and fill it out if there are things that I'm missing, or just find it a useful resource. And there are a few job listings on there right now as well. So I've been using Docker for 6 whole months, and that's why I'm in the position of giving a talk here to all of you. To be fair, I use it daily at work. My company is a very heavy user of Docker, and when I started, I really didn't have any experience with it. I'd heard of it. I had seen Michael give some talks at my meetup on it before, but I hadn't personally used it. Now that I've been in the habit of using it daily at work, I find that I don't want to start a personal project without using it anymore. Ironically, I took an older personal project and added it for this talk, and that's what we're going to be going through today. So I'm not really an expert because I'm not deploying things to production with Docker, but I do have some experience that I've gleaned from the last 6 months, and I really love it. And I want to share that love with all of you, and hopefully what I talk about today will help you be in a position to add Docker to your projects and make it so that you have an easier time developing. So in my previous Dockerless existence, I worked before this job for almost 5 years at a company that was working on a PHP-based SaaS product. It would have been a perfectly fine candidate to use Docker, but we didn't. Part of that was because we were very small, we had limited resources, so converting things to Docker would have taken time that we didn't choose to take. Part of it was also that we had a kind of a workable system for development. We used development VMs that were configured like the production VMs. We had a limited level of complexity in terms of what was involved in deploying those applications. So we were at a point where we could have started considering to do it more. We worked on a proof of concept of using an auto-scaling load balancer. And if we had moved forward with that project at the time that I was there, we probably would have switched to using Docker images instead of running a startup script essentially to get our code onto the VMs. But in the end, Docker didn't make sense for that place yet. But now, everything that I do at my current company happens in a container. My development, the first thing I do if I'm starting on a project is I spin up some containers and I edit the code in the container, or I edit in my local directory, and it's configured so that my local directory syncs with the container. Whenever we start a new project, we add a Docker file, so we know right off the bat, anybody else who comes in, they know how to build it, they know how to use it. There's a lot of Docker Compose floating around. I'm throwing some words at you now. It's okay if you don't understand them yet. I'm going to talk more about them in a little bit. But we use that to spin up suites of containers that are connected to each other and have a relationship. We even are so all in on Docker that we have a special project that we made called Debify that just standardizes some of the most common ways that we use Docker. It's specifically for Ruby projects, but it basically lets you quickly spin up a sandbox environment with networked services on a single container where you can work on one of the services in that container, or you can package that project. So here's some of the vocab that I just mentioned. So there's Docker images. Basically, it's an artifact that has the operating system, code, runtime, system tools, libraries, any settings like environment variables that you might need. A container is an abstraction at the app layer. I could read it from the screen. Let's not do that. So if you take an image and you call Docker run, it's going to make a container from that image. And usually your image has some default command that it runs. So if you're using PHP like we are in this example that I'm going to be doing next, you run Apache, you start your Apache web server. So my container on Docker run is going to start up Apache, and I'm going to have this running PHP application in a container using the image that I created. And if I have a lot of images, if I'm making a suite of microservices, for example, and I have them all in separate images, I can store them in a Docker registry. It makes it easier to deploy the applications, especially in an automated way, because I just query my registry, grab the image using Docker pull usually, and then I can get going. One second. So everybody says this first bullet is one of the benefits of Docker, that you have a standardized work environment for development. And I've already kind of said that it's possible to have that without Docker. Some of you may know that from your own experience. It seems to me that there's some languages that it's harder to do that for than others. But in addition to having developers all able to have a similar environment, you have the same benefit for your staging environment, your QA, your testing. So all your automated tests can run in the exact same configuration. And of course, production. It's easier to manage your project dependencies so that you can be sure that if it works on your machine, it's also going to work later on in production. So I don't have a situation where I've installed something locally on my machine, and so it works for me, and somebody else trying to run the same thing can't run it because they don't have that dependency installed. If I'm running it in the container has to have a command somewhere that says install this dependency. And so that other person, when they take that image or whatever artifact I give them, they're checking out the code base and they're running the same scripts that I am, they'll be sure to get that same dependency that they need because I have codified it. If you are deploying to production, I'm not going to get too much into this because it's not something I really am working on right now. It makes it easier to update your product. You just build a new image and redeploy. Finally, they have really good documentation. They have really great tutorials. And at the end of the slides that I have here, I will give some links for places I recommend to get started. Having said all that, let's just actually start working through an example. So one of the things that I'm going to use throughout the talk is a tool that we use a lot at CyberArk. The application that I'm using has some API keys in it, and I don't want to put the API key values in my code. I don't want to share my personal API keys with you during the talk, so I'm going to use this tool that we have called Summin. So the way that Summin works is I have a vault. For the talk, I'm using the OSX keyring, so you can store secrets in the OSX keyring. And when I start the container, I'm going to wrap the commands in Summin. Summin is going to go to my OSX keyring and get the values of the API keys that I need and pass them back to the running process so that that Docker container will have the credentials I need. Not critical for understanding the Docker experience. I use it all the time. I find it really convenient, and I'm going to be using it today, so I didn't want to move forward without referencing it. I also use some convenience functions because I found that there were some things that I just am doing all the time in Docker. These are the ones that I use. Other people have different ones. The first one is Docker stop all. It stops all running containers. And Docker rm all stopped clears them all out so that if I list the containers on my machine, there's going to be nothing there. I can also call clear images, which is kind of a brutal thing to do, just delete all your images, but sometimes I just get really frustrated, and that's something I do. Maybe like once a month, I just clear all my images, and then you have to repull the ones that you need. And bash container is one I use a lot also, and it runs this command docker exec and sends the container the command bash. So it gives me a bash command line interface for the container that I'm trying to get into. So you're going to see those a lot. That's why I mentioned them. So my sample application is a very basic app. It's a Twitter search interface. So I have a PHP plus jQuery web application. There's no database. Basically, you just enter the search parameters and click search, and it shows you tweets that match those search parameters. It uses the Twitter API. I kind of think that API isn't very good anymore because it doesn't return as many results as I would think, but it returns some, so it's not going to be boring. One of the search parameters I have is location. So I use the Google Maps API, and I use the Twitter API. And like I said earlier, I'll be using Summin to inject the secret values. So if I were going to develop this application and run it on my local machine, this is sort of the procedure that I would go through to do that prior to having Docker. So I'm on a Mac. I had to install MAMP, which is a one-time thing for any PHP application that you're going to run. You have to put the app in the correct directory. So wherever MAMP is looking for your documents, you have to put the application there. For this application, because I have dependencies on other projects, I have to install Composer, which is a PHP package manager, and manually run the script to install the dependencies. I can start Apache, and then I'll visit the page. So that's great. It works. It's not bad. That's how I did it originally before I knew much about Docker. And we'll do it now just to see what it looks like. But the thing that is a challenge about this is that I don't have any idea how much my local environment contributes to this application working. So some things that I want to show before I jump into actually running it. So this is the secrets.yaml file. This is what tells my application where to look in my OSX keychain for the secret, so the different API keys that I need, and it maps them to an environment variable name. So it's going to look at my OSX keyring for something called Twitter/API_key, and pass that to the Twitter_API_key environment variable. So if you end up maybe going into this project later and looking at it, that's what that file is all about. It's pretty basic. It is just a very simple web page. There's not a lot of CSS in there. Even it's just basically a web form that when you click search, calls a JavaScript function called find tweets that sends a post request after doing some parameter checking to find tweets.php, and then parses the results and appends the tweets to the div that has the search results. Okay, so if I go now and I run the demo, so I'm just calling start Apache. Let me just make sure I don't have some lingering Docker containers. Okay, so Apache's already running. So if I go to the page, it's there. I can search for the last 3 tweets from Elon Musk. And there they are. So he's upset about an Onion article that is making fun of him. So that was okay. But let's take that project now and add Docker to it. So instead of running it locally using MAMP, I can run the app in a Docker container. So to do this, the first thing I need to do is write a Docker file. And the Docker file is going to say which Docker image I should start with, any commands that I should run, any code that I should copy onto the image, and any other dependencies that I have that I want to build into my image. Once I have the Docker file, I can run Docker build, and it will build the image for me. So this is an app that has PHP. It has jQuery. It needs Apache to run. Just write these down. I know I needed Composer to install my dependencies. And that's more or less it. Yes.
Well, I like looked into Docker very briefly, and one thing that I was unsure as to how to like get files into the to not like need to import files to just have them like referenced on your main machine. Yeah, like so you code locally, and then and then run Docker referencing those files on your local machine.
Yep. So we're going to see a couple different ways to do that. We're going to start out with the Docker file that we create right now, and just copy the files into the image. So they'll be there, and when I run Docker run, the image will be spun up in a container, and I'll be able to see the files by going to my browser and verifying that they have been loaded onto the image properly. For development, it's another question, and we'll get to that. Okay. So turns out that there is an existing image that I found on Docker Hub called PHP 7.2 Apache. And it will have PHP, jQuery, and Apache. So you do have to be a little bit careful about just browsing Docker Hub and getting images from there, because if I make an image, I can push it to Docker Hub, and it would be easy to download something that has something on it that isn't what you would expect. So I try to stick to official sources for images. This is an official PHP image. It doesn't have any drivers for a database, for example, because I don't have a database in my application right now. So it's as basic as I can get it for what I'm needing to do. It doesn't have Composer on it, so that's something that I'm going to have to add. So let's look real quick at the Docker file. So this is the Docker file that I added. So it starts out by specifying the image that it should be built from. So it's from PHP 7.2-Apache. I run apt-get update, and I install Git using apt-get because Composer requires Git, it turns out. I actually didn't realize that at first, but tried it at first without that and discovered that I would be needing it. There's different ways that people recommend installing Composer on a Docker image. I could have tried picking an image that had it already on it. I didn't do that. So I just copy it from the Composer latest image into my user bin compose so that it's there for me to use. So with a lot of these things, there's choices you could make. That's a choice that I made here, but you could do it differently.
Can you quickly say why you chose that choice?
Why I did it that way?
Yeah.
Honestly, the other ones had more commands, and I wanted something cleaner.
It is. It's cleaner than what I'm doing. So.
So am I correct that Composer has no other dependencies? It's just a single executable?
It's a single executable. Yeah. But when you run, well, it depends on PHP, sure. And then you run Composer install, and it, I think we'll see it run on here maybe. So you may see it in a minute. So with that, I'm going to stop answering your question and go back to talking. This line, I'm copying the current directory that I'm in into var www.html. So that's the line that's going to take my code, because I'm in the working directory for my code repository, and copy it into the appropriate place. Var www.html is the default directory for this image. Later, we'll play around with that a little bit. I set my work to that same directory. That just means when I go into the container, it's going to put me right there. It's actually the default in this image also, so I didn't need to say that, but I liked the explicitness of it. And once all that has been done, I'm running composer install. So that ensures that my project is going to have all the dependencies that it needs in that directory. So let's
Turn off the lights that are shining on the screen.
yeah. I will try.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Ooh.
Yeah, okay. I guess it's that difference between the chalkboard people and the other people. So there's that file. So I think I said it here. We need to build the image, run the container, and then in a minute we're going to run the test suite in the container. I find it convenient to create scripts for this. So I created a script. It might be easier to see in Atom. Build image. That's just Docker build. I tagged the image. That's what that -t flag is, as Twitter search. And dot tells me that I'm building in the current directory. So that's where it's looking for the Docker file. So if I run this script right now, we can see what the output of that command looks like. So it's doing the updates right now and installing Git. It's very nicely telling me each step that it's getting to. Okay, so it did everything that it was supposed to do. It looks like I already ran composer install in this directory locally, so once it copied those files to the image, it didn't need to run it again there. So now I have a tagged image. I can see it if I call Docker images. It's the first image in the list. Twitter search. So to run it, I'm going to use the command that's in run.sh, but I'm going to look at it from here because there's a lot going on with this one. So we already did step 1, build the Docker image. Now we're on to step 2. So we have an image. We need to run it in a container. So I built a script for that called run.sh, and this is the command that it's running. And I just like to talk about the different parts of this command for a second. So Summin, I mentioned before, I wrap that around my script so that it's going to inject the environment variables that it needs. With Docker run and Summin, you have to actually pass those in an end file. So Summin is creating a temporary file that it stores the path to in this variable. And it's sending that to the Docker run command. -d means I'm going to run it in detached mode. So I'm not going to get a prompt inside the container. It's going to just spit out the container ID after this command is run. And I'll have my own command line back. And I can go in the browser and see that the command is up. This is a port mapping. I'm mapping the host or my local machine's port 4000 to 80. So the application is running on port 80 in the container, but I'm going to access it by going to localhost 4000. And Twitter search is the image name that I tagged it with. So let's just run that one now. That's it. So now I should be able to go and see my application. And there it is. And I can, let's do Nerd Summit. Oh, sad.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if I,
It's got the year.
Elon's there. I don't know what I did. I messed the Nerd Summit one up, but this one's still here. I can. This is my shameless plug for the account that I made for local tech stuff. Okay, so now we've run it. We've shown that it works. We have an image that we built. I have unit tests on this using PHP unit. What's the right way to run the tests? Well, I made a test.sh script. And it starts out very similarly to the last command that we saw. At the very end, though, I've appended the command that I need to run the tests. So instead of just saying, run it your usual way, stand up the container so I can see it in the browser, I'm saying, run the test suite, and then die. So if I can see the running containers by doing docker ps-a. So I have one running container. That's the one that has the application in the browser window. I run the test script, tells me all my tests pass, so yay. If I look again at the containers that are there, now I can see there's two. So there's this one that's been up about a minute. That's the one we saw in the browser. To run the test, it started a whole separate container using the same image. And once that command was done, it exited. So it's a nice way of being able to run your test suite. You can use this to automate a CI/CD pipeline and run your tests in containers in Jenkins, or whatever tool you use. That's what we do at work. So that's pretty convenient.
You got a great container.
Modest Torvalds or Affectionate Right. They're both good.
Modest Torvalds is
Not accurate.
yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to clear those out. So now there's not going to be anything there. All right, so we were looking at that command. So now that we've run through that process and seen what that looks like, some things to note. So we don't have to specify a command when we call docker run in that run.sh script, because the image that we're working with, the base image for my container, PHP 7.2 Apache, is pre-configured to have a default command. So by default, that container is going to run Apache 2 and start the Apache server. We saw some of these already, that you can run docker ps-a to see the list of containers that you have up. You can go to localhost 4000 to access the application. And we didn't do this, and the containers are gone, but hold on. Let's just do that real quick, because it's kind of a nice thing too. If I run that test script again, it's going to give me that test container, and I can find a container ID and the logs. So when I call docker logs, it shows me the, I don't know what it is showing there, if it's showing standard out or standard error. But in any case, I can see some of what happened in the container. That one's really handy as you're building something into an application, because as you go along, you might have issues. You might write a Docker file and it breaks for some reason. It doesn't stand up your code like you expect to. So you want to be able to use docker logs to see what it was that happened on there. You also, I find that bash container command that I showed earlier very useful, because it's nice to be able to hop into a container and set, move around in it and see, is my code in the directory that it was supposed to be in? Is the environment there like it's supposed to be? That's the way of testing to see if you've configured it correctly. So back to the Prezzo for a minute. So this just compares the two commands, the one to just run the container and view it in the browser, and the one to run the tests. So for the tests, I don't bother specifying the port mappings, because I don't need to access this container. It's just going to run the test and then die. I don't run it in detached mode, because if I run it in detached mode, it's just going to return the container ID, and I'm not going to see what happened in the test suite. And that's what I want to know. I want to know the test pass. And I override default commands so that I can run that instead. So One thing that we haven't seen yet is how to optimize this for development. So if I took that container that stood up when I ran run.sh, let's try this. So just for sanity purposes, going to remove all the containers that are there and rerun the run script. So now I have my container up. I should be able to go to the browser window and see my application there. If I go into the container, it puts me in at var www HTML, and I take, not gonna let me edit in the container because I don't have Vim installed, so that's fun. If I were to modify something on this container right now, it wouldn't be reflected in my local directory. So that can be maddening. Let's say you're using this to develop an application. So you do all this work that we've done and you have a container up and running and you go into it and you're like, well, it doesn't look like I want it to look. You know, the CSS is off, everything's misaligned, or this JavaScript has a bug in it, and so it's not doing what I expect it to do. And so you can spend all this time in the container fixing that stuff so that it works like you want it to. But what's going to happen when you exit that container? All those changes are going to die. You're not going to have anything. So that's not, in practice, how you'd want to develop. So we need to do something slightly different for development purposes. Let's see what it is that we would do. I don't know why I bother having slides, but they're there. You can reference them later. So the way that we're going to handle this is by starting from the same image that we built. But I'm going to modify my run script. I'm going to call it dev.sh. So it's running for dev. And in that script, I'm going to do the same Docker run command, but I'm going to mount the current directory as a volume in the container. So that maintains a link between the code in the current directory and that directory on the container. When I do that, if I go in the container and I fuss around in it and I exit it and remove that container, the code is still there. It's still in my current working directory. If you do this well, you can even set it up so that you can do all your Git stuff from the container. It works the other way too. If I have an IDE that I like to use on my machine, and so I'm editing the code on my local machine with the IDE, it's reflected in the container, and I'm able to see those changes that I'm making right away. So the only two things that I need to do really is I mount the repo as a volume in the container. Setting the mounted directory as a workdir is a convenience so that when I bash into the container, it puts me in that one. Otherwise, it's going to put me in var www HTML, which is where there's code, but it's not the code that is linked to my machine. So if I edit stuff in there, it's just going to be gone. And I'm going to run a script to update the Apache config so it points to the app directory instead of HTML. That way, the stuff that's in the browser is actually what's reflected in that directory that I'm working in. So let's look at what that looks like. It's pretty simple. I think to get that, I need to move forward a commit here. So I have a script dev.sh, and a lot of it should look familiar, but the things that are different are that I have this volume that maps the working directory to var www app. I make that my workdir, and I have a special script that I call as my entry point that's dev configure. So let's look at the dev configure script. It's not very complex either. It's just taking the configuration file and doing a search and replace on it. It replaces the document root line so that it points to my application. And then I start Apache because I've overridden the default entry point for the container, which would have started Apache. So I need to manually call the command to start Apache. So once I have this, starting fresh, if I do dev.sh, it's worth noting that one other change I made here is I updated the Docker file to install Vim. because I want to be able to make changes on the container and I don't want to have to do it with sed because that would get old fast. So it ran the script that I gave it, that dev configure. And at the end of my dev script, I actually told it to put me in that container. So I'm there right now. I'm on the container in the app directory. And I can verify that the app is running like it's supposed to. I can hope that Elon Musk has tweeted something different, which he hasn't yet. So that's sad. And if I want to change it, I can. So I can take the main page and I can switch it because it should be a capital T for Twitter. That's not a capital T, that is. And if I go back and refresh my page, hey, there's that capital T. So I have that link now between my local environment where I'm doing development and what's happened in the container. It makes it a lot faster to get that feedback on what you're doing and to see it working. And it's all done in such a way that somebody else could easily hop into this repository, stand it up on their own machine without installing anything special, just pulling down some images probably, and get going right away. So that gets us to a good place. But that's a pretty basic example still, where I have essentially one service that doesn't need to talk to anything else. How often does that happen in real life where you have something that doesn't need to communicate to another application? People are way into microservices these days. You need to be able to communicate to other applications. So we're gonna make it more complex by adding a database so that I can save my favorite searches. Because of the way that the PHP world is, I could have done this by finding a different Docker image to start from that had MySQL built into it. That would have been a perfectly reasonable way to do it. But it would have been boring for this talk, and I don't know, I don't think I would choose to do it like that in my life anyway. So I'm going to update the stuff that I have so that I have my standard container that I've been working with so far and a separate container for a Postgres database. So once I have these multiple services that are going to need to communicate with each other, I'm going to start needing Docker Compose. I was reading through the documentation a little bit this week, and I think that they want you to use Swarm sometimes now, but that seems like something that's maybe more important for people who are doing really complicated production apps. Docker Compose is fine for a lot of uses. So when you're using Docker Compose, it's just basically a tool for knitting together suites of services. You have to have a file, dockercompose.yaml, that gives you the configuration. So just to build my image, I had a Docker file. Once I'm starting to build in a bunch of services together, I need a second file called dockercompose.yaml. And when I want to stand them all up, I run the command dockercompose up-d. Again, that -d is detached so that I don't have to see the output. I can just use the containers. So what do I have to do to this app to make it so that I can do this? I have to update the code. Everybody's probably familiar with that kind of stuff. So I have to, add I did it with a drop-down menu that the save searches are listed in and a button on the bottom that can save a search for you if you want to save the current one. I have to add a Docker Compose YAML file that specifies how my Twitter search container and my Postgres container should be configured. And because I'm using a database and those have additional credentials in it, I'm going to add those to my secrets.yaml. This last point is valuable, but I won't get into that today. But it's similar to the process we followed before, where you kind of want to have a different version of your Docker Compose for dev. Let's just go look at that real quick. I've got to clean this stuff up. Well, it's been doing so well, going so fast. I have to get code that has everything in it. Okay, so if I look at what's in there now, did it bomb? Because of that capital T. Just for sanity. Okay, so I have now a Docker Compose file. So almost everything in this file is the services, so I'm going to scroll past that point. The only other thing besides that, I do include a volume for the Postgres database to make the data persist, although I haven't quite figured out how to make that work yet, so I don't think it's actually doing that, but I have hope it's going to happen soon. So I start out with my Postgres service. I call it PG. I use the standard Postgres 9.6 image. I put the configuration variables for the database as environment variables, and they're blank. That means that they're going to pull them from my local environment when I call Docker Compose up. So if I wrap Docker Compose up in Summin, Summin will inject them into that process, and those will have values when the database starts up. This is defining where the volume pulls its data from. I have a script in Postgres script that's going to create the database that I need. So that is all right. And then my Twitter search image. So I start with the regular Twitter search image that I build with my build script. I've got the API keys that app needs, plus the Postgres keys. I do the same port mapping I was doing before, local machine 4000 to container 80. And I note that it depends on the PG service. The only thing I need to do to get this going, probably need to rebuild the image because code has changed. There's nothing more boring than watching this happen during a talk, so sorry about that. Okay.
Well, that's why you're tempted to build a custom container, right?
Yes. Okay, so it's moving on. Step 6. Shouldn't have to do composer stuff. There we go. I stand up the containers. It creates the network, Twitter search default. It looks like I already have the volume on there. Otherwise, I would have seen creating volume happen there as well. And I should be able to go back to my page and refresh it. Now I have that save search drop down and a save search button. And this is my favorite one, so I'm going to save it. And if I clear that out, it should reload. If I refresh the page, it's still there because it's pulling it from the database. So everything is networked and connected, and it works. I'm not going to go into the development stuff because we're kind of out of time in terms of how to set up Docker Compose to be working well for development. So I will just end on this note. There are things to be wary of. Docker is designed to be very flexible. There's a lot of options. For a lot of commands that you can do, there's more than one way to do it. So we've seen entry point in command today. I think I used copy in my Docker file, but I could have used add, and they're similar. I used volume, but I could have used bind mount. I used ports because I want it to be available to my local machine, but sometimes people just use expose to expose the port within the Docker network. So there's just all kinds of weirdness happening in there, and it's easy to be scared about that. But the truth of it is that if you really get into it, even though there's a lot going on and it can seem kind of crazy, it's manageable, and it can really help you get started on developing projects, on communicating well with your team about what those projects require. And so I highly recommend that you try it out. So that's all for today. Any questions from people? Yes, Trevor.
So suppose I have a Ruby project, and what I would like is for bundle install to be run and stored in the image, probably through the CI pipeline, have a development image that I can just download and use, so that then I start up that image with my source code mounted into the image.
Yeah.
But since I think the Ruby gems are stored in the same directory,
Yes.
is there a way to say, use those, mount this, but not that?
Yeah, so I have to be honest that the way that we handle it usually, because we're a Ruby company,
Yeah.
we have bundle install run usually as part of the scripts that stand up the containers. So we don't build it into the images just because it makes the images heavier if you have all the dependencies pre-installed like that. Unless you have like a set that you use for everything. We usually try to make them kind of as light as possible. And so each project has different dependencies.
Well, the reason
Some of them are even required to have fewer dependencies.
I guess the reason I would like that for our project is we've got Node, Node project, an npm install. First of all, it's kind of dodgy.
Yeah.
It doesn't always work and takes minutes to install all our things. So it would be nice to have the standard.
So I bet there.
That has all of that.
Yeah, I bet there's a way to configure it. So you'd start from a directory that has a gem file in it, and build a Docker container from a Ruby image or something like that, and run the command bundle install after copying that directory onto the image. And then you just have to, the hard part, I guess, would be figuring out how to direct the other applications to access those files, but there's got to be some kind of flag.
Or you can map individual subdirectories. So say you've got that node modules directory and you want to use like just one or two from your host environment.
Yeah.
You could just specifically name those out and then the rest will behave, with what's
As expected.
stored in the image.
Yeah, you can have multiple volume commands in there, so like you can literally have a dozen different things that you need.
For individual files, for directories, really whatever you needed.
You also could benefit from the image caching stuff if you just copied in your gem file, for instance, and then have a bundle install command, and then your next command is actually doing volume out stuff. As long as the only stuff that's been copied in hasn't changed, it will cache that image layer. So you probably have some benefits there and just use the image caching and not even worry about building an image or anything like that.
Yes.
Work as a systems administrator, and I'm mostly using Ansible to build servers on VMs. And to make it easier for developers who are working on individual applications or CMSs or something, how would I take something like an Ansible build types of YAML command and translate that in a way that they can build the Docker environment that would most closely resemble the final server environment that they'd be in production?
That's based on the Ansible playbook that you have.
So you could use an Ansible playbook to build the Docker.
So I don't personally have a lot of experience with Ansible. There are some people, some of my coworkers have been working on it a lot. So off the top of my head, I'm not sure how they're managing that or what they're doing, but that's sort of an interesting question. I feel like Ansible should probably provide some support around that.
Probably. I just haven't worked enough with the Docker. I see why it's really useful for a developer. It's just as the system administrator, I want to make that
to standardize it.
To them.
Yeah.
So it's the other sort of, we're coming at it backwards.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're not using Docker in production, wouldn't it just make more sense to use Vagrant locally than use Ansible to provision Vagrant?
It can. I've had trouble with Vagrant across platforms. So if you don't know if they're going to end up on a Mac, PC, Linux box, what flavor of Linux, I haven't had a lot of luck in it really consistently providing the similar environment. So I'm hoping that something like Docker would work better, but I don't know.
I think Docker would not be better in that case.
No.
Vagrant across platforms, in my experience, has been better.
The Docker across platforms.
Yeah, I mean, Docker is really designed to be running on Linux because, one of the nicest things about it is that the container doesn't need a full OS. It relies on your underlying Linux operating system. So when you're running it on a Mac, there's actual virtual machine, a Linux virtual machine, running in the background that is kind of hidden from view.
I think that they on Windows they switched to the native Microsoft VM
Yeah, for a Windows Docker image, but if you're running a Linux image on Windows, I think it's still the same.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And Ansible does have Docker capabilities. It can actually natively build stuff using Docker. I haven't done any of that recently. I've been using Ansible for quite a while now, so I'll say. And as we move to Docker, it's like trying to decide where those tools actually live. With Docker, you're not configuring anything. I know you guys you do bundle installs after the container up.
I think so, yeah, largely.
I typically say golden images. I don't touch it. Once the container is running, that's it. Nothing changes within it. So I build those things into the images.
Mm-hmm.
And what that gets you is sub-second launches. You have to build into it, then all of a sudden you lose some of that, which is great
Right.
for scale.
So if you're deploying applications, that's critical. When you're delivering an appliance, it's not as big of a problem.
Right. So it's all dependent on your use case. But so in other words, Ansible I still use heavily. I use Ansible and Packer for building golden images, Amazon and whatnot, and using the same thing. I'm still struggling where those fit when I'm dealing with Docker, because Docker I have a whole different way of building and configuring that doesn't really fit with Ansible, because you don't need it after the fact. There's a whole bunch of different theories about golden images, changes after the fact. I build the golden images, I don't use it.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Well, thank you for coming. I'm gonna find a way to share these. I don't know exactly how yet, but I do have some resources at the end on the sites to go to for documentation and training, the link to the app that I was working with. We have a lot of open source stuff. So the CyberArk repo on GitHub has a lot of examples of how we use Docker, our Docker files, Docker Compose, stuff like that. So that might be a helpful resource if you're trying to get into it. And then the last is the link to the repo that I recently created with some local tech resources. And I hope you'll check it out. Thank you again.
Dr. Farnham?